Welcome to the Cast Iron Strength Podcast, your go-to source for no-nonsense, straight-talking strength training and performance solutions that work. Now, introducing your host, Mark Keys.
G'day to the beautiful listeners on the Cast Iron Strength
volume
Podcast
aspect and the skill learning aspect.
It is Tuesday, a beautiful day out here in the United States. I'm just turning in from, trying to start off Australian, but ended up being American, so I'll just be me. So this is episode 122 of the Cast Iron Strength Podcast, and today I'm going to answer again some reader mail. This are reader mail, watcher, consumer mail, some fan mail if you will, if I have fans. So someone slid up into the DMs in Insta, the Insta fam, the gram fam, with the following comments. Hi Mark, I am an inspiring strength and conditioning coach with a bit of experience in powerlifting. I've been following you for around a year now and I have questions regarding your programming. Your lifters are probably technically the best I have seen, even when they get up to top weights and sets. My question is, how do you develop this? Is it a case of a lot of low intensity, high volume work with a focus on technique? Or do you program in heavy singles so they're technically efficient? Okay, so that's the question. So basically, with this podcast, I'm just going to discuss in generalities my philosophy or my general take on how to develop strength and technique at the same time. Both of these things are interlinked, interdependent, and I'm just going to discuss how I think you should take a long-term view on developing these factors. So in the question, there was a two-part question. Well, it's a three-part question. One, how do you program to get this adaptation to get these outcomes from your lifters and their technique? Two, does it mean that you perform a lot of lower level, high volume work? Or three, does it mean that you program heavy singles to give them a chance to get used to higher threshold timing, working with 90% plus, which is a skill in itself that you can't really develop without utilizing 90% plus weight. So I think a lot of times when people ask questions for their own understanding or their own ability to communicate what they're talking about, they end up truncating what they're talking about. So they end up creating a dichotomy, or they end up creating some kind of options like a black and white option or an either or scenario, where such a scenario does not exist. If we are to develop someone's ability to display good technique in any sport, but specifically when we talk about powerlifting and strength sports, we need to do a lot of volume work. We need to do lower level work so they can understand what it is we're trying to implement. We need to do medium work. We need to do compartmentalized work to address certain issues that they may be having in their learning or in their execution. And then we need to put whatever the skill we're trying to learn needs to be put under pressure. We need to take them out of their comfort zone, because if we don't take them out of their comfort zone, then when it comes to competition, or when it comes to displaying the skill under duress, they will lack the experience, or they will lack exposure to such a scenario. And you could have the most beautiful technique in the world at 50%, 60%, 70%. But if you've never really lifted 90% plus, then I can guarantee, or if you've never simulated a competition, or if you have never done a competition with the extra pressure, the external stressors, the external stimuli, if you haven't engaged in some kind of simulation or some kind of preparation for that in your training, I can guarantee you that something's going to go wrong. Your execution will falter because you've not been in that scenario before, you've been pushed outside of your comfort zone, and therefore you can't display, you can't execute on whatever it is that you've learned. When I'm thinking about developing a lifter's technique, or when I'm thinking about developing someone's ability to execute a movement better, there's different levels of thought that go behind it. It's never a static concept. We don't go into a position where we're saying, right, we're going to do a volume block where we're only going to do volume. We'll never do any singles. We'll never put you under any pressure, and we're not going to change what we're doing. It changes. It changes session to session, set to set. I'll throw in drills. I'll throw in different cues. I'll change the goalposts. Ask any of the lifters that work with me in person, and they'll probably tell you that I change what I do a lot, because skill learning is not a static process. It's a dynamic process. As someone's understanding or someone's execution moves, then the stimuli, the feedback, however you're dealing with their development, needs to move along with them. If we're utilizing a drill, for instance, so a really good drill for learning how to squat with a neutral back position is to take a broomstick or a PVC pipe, hold the bottom end of it against your pelvis, hold the top end of it against your thoracic spine, or between your shoulder blades. So there are 3 points of contact you must maintain. You must maintain point of contact with the pelvis, you must maintain point of contact with the thoracic spine, and you must maintain point of contact with your head. Now do that and sit to a box under control. When you feel the box graze your bum, you then stand up. And this is a non-fatiguing drill, but what it is really good feedback drill. Lets the person understand what their pelvis, their upper back, their head, their thoracic spine is doing. Lets them to be conscious, to think about actually what is that doing when I'm moving through my squat. Where is it tucking? Do I feel when I get towards the box my pelvis is tucking, and maybe I need to increase the extension of the hip, so on and so forth. There's a whole bunch of firing of synapses and thought processes going on within that lifter internally. That's something you can leave a lifter with for a while, and that help them develop a picture. But once they have developed a model of that in their head, once they've developed that thought process in their head of what that actually looks like, then we need to take it from no load to a box. Then we need to take it with some kind of external load into an actual squat. So we could progress that, say, utilizing an overhead squat, or we can progress it using a front squat, where we change the orientation of the barbell, but still the person can think about what they're doing with their back. They can think about the shape of their back when they reach the bottom of the squat. Do they need to push their knees out more? Do they need to extend their lower back more? Do they need to shift their point of balance? They can take their time and think through these different puzzles and put it in a different context, and then we can move to a more specific drill where maybe we do pauses, but the pauses are at different points of the lift. So we could pause at the bottom, we could pause above parallel, we could pause at parallel, we could pause just as soon as we break our knees and hips into the squat. So then we're introducing a different point of feedback. Then we can take all of this kind of soup of change of context, all of this soup of skill learning, and then we can put it into 6 sets of 6 workout at back squat, utilizing an intensity such as 70%, where there's a decent room for error. But as fatigue builds up, they're going to have to concentrate more. They're going to have to actually produce like a worthwhile effort, probably between sets 4 and 6 on reps, 4 to 6 of those sets. They're going to be in a stage where they're fatigued. They're going to have to invoke more of the size principle. So they're going to have to access higher threshold motor units. They're going to have to actually grit and stand up hard into the bar if they have any chance of executing correctly. So then the skill gets taken out of like an easier skill learning process. So if we start way back at the start when we're utilizing the broomstick, there's very little external load, and we're letting the lifter work their way through it. We're not putting the skill under much pressure. We're letting them feel their way through it. We're letting them take their time to understand what they're doing. And then we take it into a different context where we maybe change the point of balance, change where the barbell is, maybe even change the barbell itself, change where their pause. We take the skill itself and we change some elements of it, whereas we're taking the lifter out of their comfort zone, or we're producing deliberate practice, but not by inducing an exercise stressor, not by hammering them with like heavy weights or or lots of volume. We're letting them still, they can if they want to sit down slower and think about it, they can, but the skill is being put under stress in a different manner. And then within the same session, so we cost you that as a warm-up, within the same session we then put it into an actual specific environment where through fatigue, through accumulation of volume and fatigue within the session, they're then going to have to represent a skill set that is going to be similar to hitting a 90%, 95%, 100% weight, where they're going to be fatigued, their legs are going to feel heavy, arms are weak, mom spaghetti. They're going to feel out of their comfort zone. They're going to have to take a bit of time to set up, to have a bit of mental self-talk, to think about what they're going to do, and then they're going to have to actually execute on that plan, and they're going to have to stand up with intention, and they're going to have to perform the skill in a manner that is representative of what they're actually going to do when it comes to lifting a near maximal weight. So that's in a short discussion around drilling and how to progress drills and sessions. And this is an ever-changing goalpost. There are umpteen drills we can use. There are umpteen external measures we can use. We can take videos. We can use velocity feedback. We can use audible feedback. We can use kinesthetic feedback. We can use yada yada to put the skill under stress somehow. And that's something we can progress, and that's variable in our programming that we should be progressing. But with a coach in person, this is something that is a dynamic process that changes with time. So that's an example of one thing, such as like skill learning, where we don't have a nice easy answer. Now, when we look in the planning of such a thing, what I would tend to do, or what in an ideal world, what I'd like to do with a lifter who's got some time with me, is I would like to spend some time with them going through this process and going through some beltless volume. Now, and ideally maybe no knee sleeves, like basically with as little supportive gear as possible. Reason being, it takes away layers of support, it takes away their ability to push through shit positions. For example, for someone who deadlifts with a belt and they try and be dynamic off the floor, but they try and be dynamic off the floor at the expense of their spinal integrity, at the expense of having a good lower back position. They can pull through the L4 hinge quickly. That shortens the lever arm and means they can get the bar off the floor quicker. With a belt over that part of the spine, that's something you can get away with quite a bit. You take away the belt to shore up that hinge, to shore up that joint, to shore up that fulcrum, and all of a sudden it doesn't seem like such a good idea for that person, because they're going to feel that weight going through the middle of their back, and they will realize, hopefully they'll realize, that that's not a good way of lifting the weight. They'll realize that that's not a good strategy to utilize for that movement. The same thing with squats. You get people who lift with their back too much out of the bottom, and they'll continue to lift with their back for too long during the lift. And then maybe their knees will valgus too much. They'll round their upper back. Bench press, maybe their bum will lift up. Maybe they'll flare their elbows too early. So on and so forth. There are a lot of different movement issues. There are a lot of different technique flaws that we can hide with supportive equipment, that we can't hide when we don't have supportive equipment. So I like to have periods where we remove these things from our training. And during that time, there will be much more of a focus on developing the skill itself. And we will put the skill under pressure, probably more through volume and accumulation of fatigue from volume, more through positional drills and accumulation of fatigue from positional drills, and specific warm-up drills or specific learning drills that are they can be invented, or they can be taken, or they can be applied to that person. They can be drills, ready-made drills that I have in my head, or they can be drills that I made up on the spot, specifically for that person, for the part of the skill that I am trying to put across to them. Because ultimately, what we have is I have in my head a skill representation or a model of how the lift should be executed, or what it looks like, or what it feels like when a certain lift is executed well. And as a coach, or as someone who has quote unquote superior knowledge to the person I'm working with, I need to break that down into chunks that they can understand. What we have in psychology is we have a heuristic, which is known as the curse of knowledge. And what that means is someone who is more advanced, further on in their learning process, further on in the skill development process, they can't understand why this novice or this beginner can't understand the simple fucking cue that I'm trying to put across to you, and why can't you fucking get it, you fucking idiot? Because the novice is coming from a different point of understanding. They don't have this. They don't share the same shortcuts as I have. So if I say, for example, something stupid, throw 3 reds on the bar. If you train with calibrated plates, you train with competition plates, or you train with bumper plates, the 25 kilos are red, you'll know throw 3 reds on. I mean 3 reds aside. I mean 170 kilos, put 170 kilos on the bar. But some people will get that, some people won't. People who share the same experience as me, people who share knowledge in the same area as me, they'll have the same heuristics, they'll have the same shortcuts that I have access to, and they will understand what I mean. When we're trying to impart skill, knowledge, or we're trying to show someone how to perform something properly, that's the same thing. I have heuristics, I have shortcuts in my head, I have a certain representation of what is good technique, what is a good skill execution, and for that novice, I need to find common language. I need to find places where we can meet in the middle and they can understand what I'm trying to put across. And we can do this with video, we can do this with different language, different actual words, different cues. We can do this with physical feedback, we can do it with some kind of other feedback tool. Again, we mentioned velocity feedback, bands, different positional cues, pin squats, so on and so forth. But all we're trying to do when we're utilizing different cues, we're utilizing different methods, is we're just trying to find common ground. And when we find common ground and someone can understand what I mean, then all of a sudden we have intuitive language. A good example of this was when I did a deadlift seminar in Elysium last month, and I talked about taking the slack out of the bar. And obviously this is a new concept for some people, but then once they understood the concept, I could simply look at someone, see that they weren't taking the slack from the bar, and just say slack, and they understood intuitively what I meant from that one word. And that in essence is what coaching, or what good coaching is. It's finding common ground with someone, understanding where they're at, and helping them to understand where you're coming from, so that you can enact the change that you're trying to enact. And that's part of it. That's part of having an effect on someone's technique, is being good at that process, being good at that communication process, and getting them to understand and getting them to enact what you mean when you say things. So we have that. So an initial period of higher volume work, or work where we're trying to put things under fatigue. So we're not trying to stress the intensity side of things, because it's much more difficult, or it's a lot more difficult to correct yourself when you go wrong, if it is just intensity that is the problem. If you're lifting a 70% weight for 6 reps, 70% is something you can do for 12. If you push it, there's room for error, there's room for correction. So that's why I try and utilize lighter intensities with more volume, when we're trying to initially enact the change, or it can be if we're not maybe looking to enact the change, we're just looking to reinforce good technique. So something I always do with myself, I'll take periods of 4 weeks, periods of 8 weeks, periods of 12 weeks, where I'll remove knee sleeves, belt, perform lower intensity, higher volume work, just to reinforce what I'm trying to do to build momentum, build good practice, so that when we do put it under pressure, you're gonna revert to good execution as opposed to reverting to bad execution, because you've stressed yourself too much, you've stressed your body too much, you're constantly under fatigue, you're constantly trying to find a way to lift a weight, and you end up running your back in a deadlift, you end up kicking your arse out in a squat, you end up doing suboptimal things because you're just trying to, basically your body and you are just trying to survive the program. You're trying to survive the loading. You don't have the luxury of evaluating and trying to change what you're doing, because you're just trying to get through the fucking workout. And that's basically where a lot of people go wrong, and that's where a lot of bad technique comes from, is people simply trying to just survive. They overload themselves far too much. They're trying to increase their numbers every week, trying to increase their numbers every month. They're not taking a long-term view of what they're trying to do, which is move optimally first, or move as optimally as you can within the time frame you're dealing with. So if you have a 16-week block, I would happily sacrifice 4 weeks, 8 weeks of that time to get movement improvements. Because when we have the movement correct, when we stress it with intensity and overload, the results are going to far outstrip any progress you can load for 16 weeks with bad movement, and you can get a gain. But I guarantee you, if you take the time to implement better movement, to implement a more optimal technique within a 4 to 8 week window, say, we can definitely enact better improvement in that 4 to 8 weeks than we would have done if we just overloaded for 16 weeks, because we're going to move more efficiently. And efficiency, when it comes, or removing inefficiency when it comes to maximal tasks, is the easiest yardage you can make. So you'd be fucking insane not to make the yardage.
So we've covered off the volume or the skill learning approach in as much detail as we're probably going to be able to go through in a podcast without actually doing a course on skill learning. So the next aspect is the intensity side of it. So when it comes to lifting heavier weights, or comes to higher threshold weights, the only way to get better at doing that is to get into those zones. So if we're talking about lifting 90% plus weights with a belt and knee sleeves, the only way to become better at that, or to move optimally like that, is to put on belts, to put on knee sleeves, and to lift those loads. Whether it's singles, doubles, or triples, however we're going to manipulate it, that's the only real mechanism that we have to actually get better, to optimize our movement at those intensities, or with those intensities. That the same goes with knee wraps, squat suits, deadlift suits, etc. The only way to improve in kits, or to improve at those intensities, is to train in the kit that you're going to utilize, or to train at the intensities that you want to optimize. So we need to have that element in our practice or within our training to be able to display the skill learning that we've done with lower intensities, with different drills, while under fatigue. It doesn't mean that we have to wait till we're in a peaking phase, or we have to wait until we're in a strength building phase to do singles, to do higher percentage lifts. Something I will do with people a fair bit is throw in some singles after maybe they've done a set of 6 sets of 6 or 6 sets of 4 with a skill learning emphasis. I may, with that person, depending on what we're trying to look at, just single up with them and see what they can utilize without a belt, without knee sleeves, and try to push them that way. And that will help. That's a good thing for buy-ins. So it'll show them that most of the time they'll be able to set a pretty decent beltless PB, and for some people they've actually set outright PBs after doing 4 to 6 weeks of skill-focused movement, or skill-based movement with a higher volume and lower intensity, but they've managed to set a new 1RM without a belt, without knee sleeves, because they've increased their capacity, but that's not actually where their capacity is at. Their capacity could be much further on, could be another 20 or 30 kilos above what they've done. But to access that higher capacity, to be able to show that extra capacity or to be able to develop that extra capacity, they need to train at those intensities. So they need to train at 90% and above. They need to utilize belt, knee sleeves, etc. So within a well-developed program, you're going to have these elements. You're going to have a skill-focused element where we're trying to practice, we're trying to give feedback, we're trying to put a skill under pressure in different ways. We're going to have a base building or momentum building phase. We're going to allow the lifter, the athlete, to understand things in their own time, to take in what we're trying to say, to work through it on their own, to develop themselves as a lifter, to develop their own technical representation in their own head of what they're trying to achieve. Then we're going to pressure it with fatigue, we're going to pressure it with volume, and then eventually we're going to pressure it specifically within what we want. So if we're trying to produce a better competition results, then we're going to practice, or we're going to try pressure it under competition rules. So we're going to squat with a belt, knee sleeves, we're going to squat to the depth required, and we're going to squat in the manner required. So we're going to, if it's out of a squat rack, we're going to stand up, clear the squat racks, set up, take some time, squat with a weight, and then stand with the weight for some time to simulate getting a squat and a rack command within a bench press. If we want to emulate what we've done within training to a competition, we need to train with a hold at the top. We need to train with a pause. We need to train with a hold at the top to simulate a start command, a pause command, and a rack command. For deadlift, we're going to need to train without straps, so that's the name that we utilize. We need to replicate the performances that we've done in the gym, or we need to replicate in the gym performances required specifically, or we need to perform specific to a competition within the gym. We need to simulate what we're going to experience on the platform or on the field of play. That needs to be simulated in training, and that needs to be put under pressure within training for us to be able to actually get a good outcome when we actually go into a competition scenario, or when we go into producing a new 1 rep max. We need to have some training, we need to have some period of preparation specifically within that environment to produce the best outcome possible. That's probably going to conclude this episode. Thanks very much for the question. If you have any questions for me, you can slide up into my DMs on Instagram. You can hit me up on Facebook. You can shoot me an email at markkeys, markkeys@gmail.com. You can leave me a comment in the YouTube section of this episode. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Mark Keys, and I will see you in the next episode of the Cast Iron Strength podcast. Thank you and goodbye.